Joining us right now is Kevin Book. He is Clearview Energy Partners Managing Director. And good morning to you, Kevin.
Morning.
Help us just try to make sense of where we are, what this means to oil in the short term, what it means in the long term. S&P out saying that this effectively takes out any extra supply and any of the give in the system right now. How do you estimate where we really are?
Yeah, that's exactly the point. Thanks for having me. The spare capacity in the world that comes from OPEC producers mostly resides in Saudi Arabia. When the Saudis can't come to the rescue, it leaves about 1 million barrels per day, with everyone, including Russia. So that's a very narrow cushion against a supply shock, in addition to the supply shock we've got. Then you have to look on top of that strategic reserves. There's technically a lot of capability, but getting that capability onto the water when most of the crude in the U.S. is bottlenecked because, well, frankly, we're exporting so much, it's hard to get more out. So it is going to have to happen elsewhere in the world. Other countries aren't as excited about drawing down crude. So what you have is a relatively narrow cushion. Saudi Arabia is a big part of ensuring global supply security.
So, Kevin, here's the question. Aramco has somewhere between 35 and 40 days worth of supply. There's an estimate they can get a third of that capacity back online early this week. I don't know if you believe that. Do you believe in the next 30 to 45 days all this is fixable?
So I think we have to think about it two ways. First, do they have capacity they can bring back quickly? They might, because there were two sites attacked. The Corrales field could come back sooner. But second, you have to ask, what happens in a benign refinery fire? Think about what happens in our country when it's not a bomb attack or a missile attack, but just something that caught fire and exploded. Weeks to get it back online. We're now talking about incredibly sophisticated, one-off, custom-built processing infrastructure. I think we're talking weeks to months before it's fully restored. It's perfectly rational to wait and see and learn what we learn when we know it, but I think probably the calming bias that you get right now with the idea of 2 or 3 days may be a bit overly optimistic.
And what about the sort of larger concern that this really demonstrates the fragility of the system? Is it actually more fragile today, or actually I could argue maybe it's less fragile given actually the resources we now have in the United States, for example?
Yeah, absolutely. The molecules are still coming to America in a way that they would not have a decade ago when our import dependence really could have jeopardized supply. Price still comes home. That's the globally connected system. But we've been writing for months about how this risk has really not been priced into the market. It's important to remember what pushing Iran out of the market does. It means Iran doesn't have to care nearly as much when it's not an oil seller to the world. It opens up a world of new risk, not just from Iran, but also from its non-state and affiliated proxies. And that's what we're looking at here. We're also looking at a world where knock-on risk becomes possible. Think about this. That narrow supply cushion I talked about, that means opportunistic actors, whether they be non-state actors or states that want to interfere with supply, now don't have to do very much. A big force multiplier to a small disruption.
I want to bring in Brian Sullivan,
Kevin,
who's in Houston.
Sullivan.
Hey, Brian.
Hey, Brian.
Yeah, hey, Andrew. Thanks very much. Hey, Kevin, how are you? Listen, we don't import that much from Saudi Arabia anymore. We used to import about 2.2 million barrels a day 20 years ago. Now it's about 600,000 barrels a day, basically one ship. So for us, we've got our own oil. China, they import about 1.5 million to 1.7 million barrels a day. By the way, you might have heard about this trade war. They've got this tariff on imported U.S. oil. Do you think there's any chance, Kevin, that China, because they need Saudi oil may now be offline, that they eliminate the tariff in the short term on U.S. imported oil because simply they don't have the supply from anywhere else?
Brian, I'll see you that and I'll raise you. How about this? I think it's a time for a lot of pragmatic flexibility on both sides of that divide and others. Think about this. Not only do you have to want to source crude anywhere you can get it. The Saudis, after all, were standing in for a lot of the Iranian crude that have been forced off the market. But on that note, some of the importers that have been forced to stop buying Iranian and Venezuelan crude might want to start buying it even though the risks of those sanctions are high. That might not be something the U.S. government condones, but they might tacitly accept it if prices begin to climb back up. What we're looking at are these incredibly import-dependent Asian countries. 96% net import reliance in Japan, 91 in Korea, 75 in China. These countries can't do without imported crude, and so they're going to get it anywhere they can. That's going to focus a lot of pragmatism.
Hey, Kevin, the other thing that I've been trying to understand is when you think about the price of crude, given that we're basically at this price just a couple months ago,
right?
Is this really a demonstration, actually, that maybe there really isn't that big a shock here, and that maybe there won't be?
You know, I've got a couple of colleagues who worked as national security advisors on this issue in different administrations, and they spent their careers fearing this moment. This was the biggest thing that could happen in crude, and here we are, looking, as you say, at a price that was just recently in the rearview mirror. There's nothing that better illustrates the twin effects of U.S. supply buffering the risks to the global system and also the weak demand environment in which we find ourselves. But let's not kid around here. The second half of the year is cyclically stronger from a demand perspective. Even if the worst recessionary headwinds are in our face, we're still going to see more crude demand coming up as the second half of the year wears on.
Hey, so Kevin, real quick before you go, though, play out the sort of worst case permutations in this whole geopolitical situation when the president says that he's locked and loaded, given the trade battle between the U.S. and China, what you think this means to China. I mean, sort of give us a macro view of all this as well.
Well, I'm so glad you asked, because we just put out a note on this. The use of the word terrorists on the Saudi press agency's communiques and their specification of the Houthis rather than Iran is really, I think, their way of saying we don't necessarily want a sovereign conflict. We don't want to necessarily draw in with our fingerprints on it the U.S. Essentially executing, the Saudis pulling the trigger on the U.S. gun, because that takes us into something new, out of the economic pressure and into hot war. 1980s vintage, essentially, country-on-country sovereign attacks on infrastructure. That could be a very different world. So it's possible that we may see attacks outside of Iranian territory, and that might be a way of providing sort of a stand-down from a direct escalation. As far as China, look, the long-term here is secure. Supply security has always been their first concern. What's energy security in America? Low prices. What's energy security in China? Enough energy. They're going to be focused on that for the long haul.